Joe, we continue on our path in doing deep dives. Now, just for the Penn State fans that don't know, we did this all last year. We have continued again this year doing deep dives on basically the top 30 teams in college football this upcoming season. Today, we land on Penn State. My good friend, I go to you first. Your thoughts on the Nittany Lions?
Yeah, this is a roster that relatively was picked apart over the offseason. They lost a lot of defensive talent to the draft. I'm talking about Chop Robinson, Adisa Isaac at their edge positions, Kalen King, Johnny Dixon, Daquan Hardy in their secondary, Hunter Norzad, Olu Fashanu from their offensive line, who were all conference players. And then in the transfer portal, they lost Keandre Lambert-Smith at receiver and King Mack. I'm optimistic knowing that Kotelnicki, who they brought in as offensive coordinator from Kansas, is going to get this run game popping with Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. I think that they're going to put up a ton of yards on the ground. But I am really freaking worried that last year we spent the whole season leading into the big games that they had. The one thing I kept bringing up, they do not have the weapons on the outside to move the football. And you know what? They still don't have the weapons on the outside to move the football.
You're not a Julian Fleming fan?
He's fine. He hasn't really produced. I'm sure that he'll be a decent player, but their receiver room has regressed. Here's where things get weird, though. As skeptical as I am about their roster, and a little bit worried that they're going to be weak at certain position groups, they don't have to encounter Ohio State or Michigan. They got a really freaking easy Big Ten schedule. I only have 4 games that actually cause fear for me, and there's a good chance that they win 3 of these 4 games. I'm talking about at West Virginia, at USC, at Wisconsin, and versus Washington. Mm-hmm. So there's a realistic shot here that they just end up going 10-2 again. Go to the playoff with a weak team that doesn't really belong being there.
I wouldn't go that far, Joe, to say that they're weak.
They will be. If they go 10-2, they're not weak. They're weak amongst the playoff field. There's going to be a team that gets left out that we could sit here and I promise you in December.
I'm not disagreeing.
We're going to be yelling about one team that didn't get in, and Penn State's going to be the 11th or 12th seed.
Who are the 2 teams you think they lose to?
Probably USC because it's just a far trip, and Wisconsin or West Virginia.
They would really lose to USC?
It's just a lot of travel. When was the last time they traveled that far? Except for the Rose Bowl.
I mean, I don't know. I think that you bring up an interesting point, but I mean, you legitimately have 2 running backs, and Allen and Singleton, that can run all over that defense. I mean, can USC stop them regardless of how far that they travel?
Yeah. I'm throwing that only off of like just a total trip. That's it.
I got you. I agree with you on one massive point, okay, that I do think that their schedule is very favorable for them. And I do think it plays into that they like their floor. Joe, I can't believe I'm going to say this. I do think their floor might be 10-2. Like I because of how favorable it is.
Yeah.
I'm going to say something, and I'm going to double down on something I said last offseason, but as Drew Allar got more consistent. Now, Joe, I will say that I do think that he actually is a pretty damn good decision maker. But we mentioned early in the show, he was one of 5 quarterbacks in last year's college football that had over 300 passing attempts with less than 5 interceptions. Joey had 25 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. The games that they lost were games that he was missing dudes that were wide open. My question becomes, Joe, what if I'm not saying that he hits all those passes, okay? I'm not saying that. My question becomes, what if he hits half of the ones that he missed? What if he does become a little bit more consistent as the second year as a starter? Joe, I look at their secondary. Kevin Winston returns. Obviously, he's a junior. He was their leading tackler last year. Jalen Reed returns. Dennis Sutton had 6 sacks last year. Durant had 2 sacks, but 5.5 tackles for loss. 4.5 coming at the last 4 games of the season. They do have production returning. we could talk about so many things. I think their offensive line has questions, and I think that we need to talk about that. The question ultimately, though, comes for me. Joe, I do see pieces that can be worked with here. Am I saying that they're going to win the Big Ten? No, I'm not. I'm not saying that, and nor am I going there. I do think that they got to kind of prove it, to people. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a bad way to put it, but maybe they do. Joe, if Drew Allar, what we've seen from young quarterbacks in the past that do have the talent, Joe, either he's going to be Joe Milton and he doesn't take a step forward, or Joe, now with a new offensive regime, can a new offensive regime take him to that next step? Now, I would remind people, okay, the two big games that he misperformed in, okay, were obviously the two biggest games on their schedule that he just did not look good in. I think Manny Diaz not being there is more of a bigger deal than Penn State fans are giving it, I say credit for, but that they are realizing at the current moment. I think every bit of their success, every bit of where that they want to go, comes and falls on the shoulders of Drew Allar. But, Joe, he's got to start throwing the ball down the field with more consistency. You say that they don't have weapons. Now, I went and looked this up today. Did you know of this? So he was a 60% completion percentage guy. Mm-hmm. Of a third of the passes that he missed, guys were covered. I think what PFF is saying here that he missed that was just not in the general direction. Drew, 67% of the receivers that he threw to that was not completed, of that 60% or 40%, excuse me, 67% of guys were wide open. My question becomes, do they have the weapons and he's missing them?
No, I've watched enough. I had to watch enough Penn State film last year, and I don't.
Explain to me missing 67% of guys being open. Because that is a massive number.
Yeah, this is why I don't like cherry picking stat. This is why I don't like PFF that much, because I think that it's easy to find those numbers and we can sit here and talk about that. Because
I'm not saying that they do have weapons. What I'm asking you is how is he missing that badly?
It was a lot of it comes down to the play calling, and that was why they made the change and why they moved on to a different offensive coordinator. You could tell that he was confused a lot in his decision making. He was one of those guys that was holding the ball.
A lot of young quarterbacks.
Yeah, I what you're getting at here though with him, that was one of the things that I wrote down, is that it all comes down to what does Drew Allar do this upcoming year? Most of, if not all of his best games came against the weaker part of their schedule, and the only two really crap your pants games that he had where he played poorly were Michigan and they were Ohio State, and he was pressured a ton. There weren't a lot of open guys for him to get the ball to. The play calling was really soft in those games. Mm-hmm. I think it makes me feel really good knowing that their schedule is going to be as easy as it is, and that how well he played in those types of games. He can replicate the games that he had against Illinois, against teams like Wisconsin and Washington and USC and West Virginia. This might be a year where he has an unbelievable season, and then he gets to the playoff and then doesn't play up to that expectation. He is going to have a much easier time, I think, just generally. And I also think that Kotelnicki hasn't really coached up a guy of Drew Allar's play style. Prabula, who's the backup, he's more experienced with working up with guys like that, which are mobile. Jalen Daniels, run the football. Jason Bean, run the football type of guys. But I think that having someone as gifted as him offensively is going to help him so much.
I went back and watched the Ole Miss game today. Tyler Warren had 5 catches, 127 yards. How much this, So I do think when Allar was on, they had times where they could get dudes the ball. The question becomes here, and I understand that that's a bowl game. It is what it is. They do host Ohio State on November the 2nd. I don't think that they're a bad team. I still think that they're a very physical team.
No, they're nothing.
Here's my biggest complaint with them. I think they're exactly where they need to be based off of how they've recruited, how the state is, okay? And when it comes to recruits, Joe, they're just not a pro. I think they're exactly where they need to be. Now, do they want to take that next step? Yeah, well, you got to do other things to take that next step. I do think that James Franklin needs to get out of play calling. I think he's got to get his hands out of the offense. And I do think things would get better if he got his hands out of that offense. I 100% believe that it would. The question becomes, does he?
Well, how much? I mean, I don't know.
Joe, we have footage of him with play sheets on the sidelines well before they fired their OC. So my question becomes, Joe, you know what's crazy about all of this? Like, man, he's had his hands in this offense for a long time, and things haven't remotely changed. Schematically, Joe, they're not vastly different than what they've been under him his entire regime.
Well, this is where Kotelnicki comes into play, because he is the complete opposite of everything that they've done. Complete opposite of everything.
You're about to find out who's really going to be calling plays and have their hands on things.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, the big thing here is I'm not saying that they're bad. Absolutely, I'm not saying that. And I'm not saying that this is going to be a doomsday type season. They are exactly where I always expect them to be. They don't have a Saquon Barkley or a Chris Godwin. They don't have an elite offensive player that is going to help them take a step forward. They just don't. That's where what I feel like in the years that they've been a little bit more successful than being a 3-loss team is that they had something to rely on. And Nick Singleton and Katron Allen can be those guys, especially Nick Singleton. I just really don't totally know if they're going to get that out of them, especially with a bit of a reworked offensive line. Again, we might not really find out how good this team is until January. That's the reality that we have.
Well, you definitely won't find out how good this team is really until November the 2nd when they play Ohio State.
Wait, do they play Ohio State?
Yeah, November the 2nd.
Why did I miss that when I wrote down their schedule?
I don't know. But I must have missed it too, but we got corrected in the chat.
Oh, they do play Ohio State. I forgot to write that down. All right, well, they still lose to them.
You know what's interesting, though? Their new OC, and there's a reason I'm not trying to attempt Kotelnicki's name here. Here's the thing that I would push back just a little in reference to their offensive line. Okay, he was a center at Wisconsin Whitewater. All right, and when
Morzad?
Who
are you talking about?
Kotelnicki.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, was a center, yes. And dude, that Kansas O-line was not that bad. And that's a position group that he vehemently had his hands on. I agree with you in the sense of they have pieces that they have to replace. If my man can do it at Kansas, he can do it at Penn State.
Yeah, but it's a different animal.
I'm not saying it's not a different animal, but you can't. But Joe, what you can't do is say that kids at one school develop and that kids at another won't because it's different. The level of development might not be as high because he's playing vastly different opponents. Joe, the guy's been pretty well known as an offensive line guru, though.
Look, I like what he does, and I'm a big fan of him. But at the same time, Kotelnicki also relies on the fact that they're going up against defensive lines that are not as big as some of the other conferences, not as big as the SEC and the Big Ten, but also the whole offense was predicated on spreading things out and getting the ball out quickly. I don't know if that works in the Big Ten or if they had to play an SEC team in the playoff. I don't think it does. And I think the perfect example, I understand that Bean stepped in that game, but when they played Texas, Kansas got punched in the mouth along the line of scrimmage. That whole line struggled that day. They had a lot of problems in the whole second half. They couldn't really move the ball as easily because of that defensive line kicking their ass. So I just have a little pause on assuming that he's going to get that offensive line right.
Oh, I didn't say that they were going to be elite.
Yeah.
I just said that they're going to develop. All right. Well, look, I'm going to make a bold statement before we wrap this up.
Mm-hmm.
I think Drew Allar takes the next step. I really do. I'm going to be funny here because I'm going to use something that you say. I do like the kid's traits. I do, and you know how much more than traits that I love more than anything. I really do love his decision making. When I say that, people are like, "Oh, Blake, what are you talking about? His decision making?" Yeah. When you have that many passing attempts and 2 interceptions, I don't care if he's dinking and dunking all over the place. He can make right decisions. And for a young I can work with a kid that makes right decisions. He does have the traits and right decision making. The question becomes, does he take that next step? If he does, they can be better than what people expect them to be.
Yeah, it all comes down to Allar. Enough said.
100%. Well, look, I doubled down. I admitted last year where I was wrong. I really liked
listening to me at the time.
Well, I like the kid's decision making. And I will take a kid in college that makes right decisions over a kid with traits any day.
Make sure you check out Bet Online for all of your sports betting needs. For anything that I do betting related, I go on over to betonline.ag and I use promo code BELIEVE50. BetOnline has all of the latest updated odds for the NFL and college football seasons. Anything you need, whether it's futures, live in-game betting, no matter what, your football betting needs are met at BetOnline. And again, make sure you use that promo code BELIEVE50, BLEAV50 to get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet Online, where the game starts.